Another successful range practice is in the books. But now, what to do about all of these? The Snider-Enfield. Ammunition, Part 1. In this part, we'll discuss some historical background, the components of historical ammunition, the modern Snider Bullet. It will also deal with preparing your brass, fire forming, cleaning, and priming. By the middle of the 1860s, it was clear that muzzleloading technology, however advanced, had had its day. In the end, it was the breech loader, combined with the self-contained cartridge, that would finally supplant the centuries-old concept of loading from the muzzle. The Snider and its cartridge occupy a unique position in the evolution of military firearms, for they both hold characteristics that firmly place them with, shall we say, one foot in the past and one in the future. The rifle proper, being a conversion of the Enfield muzzleloader, had a great many similarities with weapons of an older age. The cartridge, too, being the subject of this video, reeked of this curious mix of old world and new. Regardless of its failings, the Snider and its cartridge would give the armies of empire a solid, reliable, and effective weapon that would see service until the end of the 19th century. The Snider cartridge was born of the last era of muzzleloading arms, that of the Enfield. Now all ammunition has four parts: the projectile, the propellant, the primer, or some sort of ignition, and the case, or something to hold it all together. The Enfield cartridge was a relatively complex but highly effective design that used multiple sheets of paper and card rolled on a mandrel to form a container, thus enabling the bullet and propellant to be held together in the most efficient way possible. The primer, of course, being the separate percussion cap. When confronted with how to create a cartridge that would hold all the components together, this concept of creating a tube around a mandrel was perpetuated, only for the Snider, this would be made of brass, for durability and to ensure it would seal the breech on firing. A piece of brass foil, 3/1000ths of an inch thick, was wrapped around a former, and then a piece of paper was cemented to the outside. This tube was then fixed into a base, initially of the same brass foil, made into a cup shape, but later of a series of cups and an iron base. These components were fixed together by the insertion of the anvil and primer, which riveted the whole together. The bullet used in the Snider cartridge was itself of the same curious mix of old and new, as used in the Enfield cartridge, to ensure that the bullet gripped the rifling on firing. The Snider bullet used the same kind of hollow base and a base plug. The Snider bullet had other characteristics worthy of mention as well. It had been discovered that by moving mass to the outside of a spinning body, its stability was dramatically increased, and so the Snider bullet was provided a second cavity in the nose. This initially would be filled with a small plug of wood, but later would be left empty, simply spinning the lead over the top of the bullet to form a solid, smooth nose. This greatly increased the stability of the projectile, and also had a secondary characteristic. It was found that it created what would today be called a hollow point effect. The Snider would quickly develop and maintain throughout its life a reputation for creating ghastly wounds, and whose terminal effects were undeniable. The bullet proper was cannulered and lubricated with beeswax. It was swaged of pure lead and measured .573 in diameter, with the lubrication being .577 overall. A small amount of carded wool was placed on top of the powder before the bullet was inserted into the casing. By crimping it in the mouth of the case, the four components were thus assembled into one complete package. So was born the service's first centerfire, self-contained rifle cartridge. The Snider cartridge was not perfect, and it would evolve through an astonishing 9 marks in a period from 1866 to 1871. In these marks were incremental changes to the casing, the bullet, and the markings. As shown, the historical Snider bullet was very complex and was made by swaging. Replicating this design by casting is exceptionally difficult. To this end, a more conventional design is desirable. There are a number of options. At first glance, the Snider bullet looks very similar to a style of bullet colloquially known as the Mini, especially in the United States. It resembles this hollow-based bullet design by Burton, which was used extensively during the American Civil War. Indeed, apart from the hollow nose, it certainly does. The issue with this very commonly found and used projectile is with its caliber. This is typically .575 for use with .577 or .58 caliber rifle muskets. Now, the Snider will load and fire these projectiles reliably and without complication. Typically, though, it will fire them without one other key component: accuracy.
Are you kidding me? What is that, 25 yards?
A hollow-based bullet of .575 trying to expand out of a casing and then into the rifling just doesn't seem to work without a base plug. So commonly, one's experience with shooting Civil War bullets in a Snider is disappointing at best. Enter the X-Ring Services .600 Snider bullet. This round, considerably bigger than those mentioned before, is of groove diameter, which in the Snider at the breech is nominally .605, and fills the rifling immediately on firing without the need to expand. This leads to far greater accuracy and a much more rewarding shooting experience. There are other designs. The most successful of these seem to be of this type of shape. So, with our bullet selected, casting can begin. Casting is quite conventional. I do it outside over a camp stove. Pure lead is typically used for Snider bullets, and therefore the lead must be quite hot. It's important to keep the flow of lead flowing over the top of the mold while casting. This minimizes air pockets. Once solidified, the sprue can then be cut off with the sprue cutter. The mold is then opened and the bullet removed. I let mine cool on a cotton towel. The mold is of high quality, and you can knock out a fair number of bullets quite quickly. Although not absolutely necessary for casual short-range shooting, I always weigh and sort my bullets. Using a scale that's graduated to the 1/10 of a grain, I sort the bullets by the half grain, these being in the neighborhood of 532 grains. Once weighed, I sort them into batches of 10, the contents of an ammunition packet. Once the bullets are sorted, the next step is to lubricate them, very important with a black powder firearm. The lubricant I use is 50% beeswax and 50% shortening. This is adjusted for the season, being stiffer in the summer with more beeswax and slightly softer in the winter with more shortening. I keep it in a jar and melt it in the microwave. The procedure is fairly simple. The bullets, the lubricant, and a piece of wax paper laid down to keep the mess off the table. Using pliers holding the bullet slightly above the lube grooves, I double dip each round and place it on the paper. The whole process moves along quite rapidly once you get into the rhythm. You'll note that I don't size these bullets. They come out of the mold ready to go. With brass foil casings being very hard to replicate and not worth the trouble at all for serious shooting, modern drawn brass is used. Purpose-made casings and indeed manufactured ammunition is available, but they are both prohibitively expensive. A cheaper and equally serviceable solution is to use 24-gauge brass shot shells, modified in length and formed correctly. You can make them yourself with a set of dies. I got mine from X-Ring Services. Before we carry on with the process of loading and creating the ammunition, mention needs to be made of what to do with your brand new brass, whether you've purchased it or you've made it. This process is known as fire forming. In this process lies somewhat of a paradox. As mentioned, for accurate shooting, a bullet ranging from .590 to .600 is usually the best. The problem is, a bullet of this diameter will not fit into new brass. You can see in this photograph the very slight difference between the unfired with a slight neck and the fired that has been fire formed to the chamber of the rifle. and is resultingly slightly larger at the neck. Only in this fired state will the casing accept a bullet of .600. So, in order to fire your Snider brass for the very first time, you have to use a bullet that you would not necessarily want to use for regular shooting. A bullet such as the .575 Burton as commonly found, or indeed a .575 round ball, is something that you need to acquire in order to fireform your brass. I happen to have a mold for this kind of bullet, and I've used it for fireforming all of my Snider brass. The process for loading this bullet into the brass is exactly the same as with the .600 bullet that we will ultimately want to use for regular shooting. This process will be covered in a later chapter. These bullets are prepped in exactly the same way, with one exception. I lube them, but then, as a matter of course, I run them through a simple push-through sizer to ensure that they're sized correctly for the new brass and also trim away any excess lubricant. These bullets then will be the ones we'll use when firing your brass for the first time. A point to critically understand is that once the brass is fireformed, no more sizing of it need be required for subsequent shooting. Now, if your brass is brand new, you can skip this chapter and refer to it later after you've fired off your first batch of ammunition. Here, we'll talk about how to clean your brass after firing. The method I'll demonstrate here is known as wet tumbling. The necessary components are thus: a wet tumbler, in this case a Rebel 17, with its watertight drum and 6 wing nuts. Simple dish soap or washing up liquid. An optional ingredient is detergent booster, as provided with the tumbler. A sieve with fine enough mesh not to allow the media to escape. And of course that critical ingredient, the stainless steel media. It's in the form of short rods, about 1/4 inch in length. As mentioned, the sieve has to be fine enough not to allow the media to fall through. You'll also need a wash basin or tub to catch everything as you empty the tumbler. Now, this is what you might call a high-end way to clean your brass, but there's no denying its effectiveness. It takes the grottiest, dirtiest brass and turns it to looking almost new. This includes the primer pockets. The first step in cleaning your brass is decapping. For this process, I use 2 tools. One is a jig with holes drilled into it to allow for the spent primers to be punched out. This view shows with clarity just how dirty brass fired with black powder can get. The second tool is a punch. This can be made out of a nail with the end ground small enough to fit through the primer flash hole. You can see that it punches the primer out just as effectively as any other kind of machine. Also note the state of the primer pocket in just how dirty it is. This as well, the inside of the case. Once decapped, the casings are placed into the tumbler along with the stainless steel media. Then the tumbler is filled with cold water to within 1 inch from the top. With the tumbler full of water, we add the soap and the detergent booster. The directions recommend using only a small amount, maybe the size of a quarter. The 2-part lid is then placed on top. First, the rubber gasket, followed by the metal plate, which is secured in place with the 6 wing nuts. The drum, thus closed and watertight, is placed on the rollers, and all that remains is to turn it on. You'll note that it is rather loud in its operation, so having it perhaps in the bedroom or next to a sleeping child may not be the best place for it. The time it takes to get everything clean does depend on the amount of brass and the amount of fouling, but generally at least a couple of hours are required. The lid is unfastened by undoing the 6 wing nuts, and you will be confronted with the blackest water you have ever seen. It does recommend that you use cold water for this process. The cooling that the water will undergo will suck the lid down onto the drum, if hot water is used to begin with. I first pour out the majority of the dirty water. Then, when most of it's gone, I empty the rest into the sieve, which itself is sitting inside the wash basin. Whatever media is left in the drum, it doesn't really matter, as it's stainless steel and doesn't rust. Then you can begin the secondary rinse and the separation of the brass from the media. This is best done when underwater. Naturally, some media escapes over the edge of the sieve when you dump the brass out. To capture that back, simply pour the wash basin back through the sieve and you've collected all the media. As mentioned, it's best to clear the media from the brass using water, either running or while the casing is submerged. Note the inside and how clean it is, including the primer pocket. Drying the casings is as simple as placing them out in the sun on a nice day, or indeed just overnight on a towel. But for those days when it's wet and rainy and damp and dark and, well, I just want them dry right now, I have a secret method. What's a good source of circulating warm, dry air? Why, a food dehydrator, of course. In a normal model, you can dry hundreds of cases at once. Simply distribute the wet cases in varying levels, place the lid on top, and turn it on. It only takes an hour or so, and once you're done, the cases are ready for storage. Note that I'm storing them in a jar specifically labeled to the rifle. More on that later. I can safely say, having used other methods of cleaning brass, from a simple slosh around in soapy water, to gently scrubbing them with a brush, to tumbling them in a dry tumbler with corncob media, I will never go back to any of those now that I've used the wet tumbling method. If you're dealing with brand new brass, you will have skipped the cleaning chapter and come straight here. If you've just finished cleaning them, then we can pick up and carry on. The MagTech brass takes large pistol primers. To prime the cases, I use a fitting that attaches to the press. It holds 100 primers and makes things fly along quite quickly. Using this plunger arrangement, it positions a primer underneath the casing. Then, with a little push on the press handle, it seats the primer in the pocket. So now, we've got the major components ready to go. The bullet has been cast and lubricated, and the cases have been cleaned and primed. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of the Snider ammunition series. We've gone over the history, historical ammunition, as well as the various components and the preparation thereof. In part 2 of this series, we'll cover how to assemble those various components into the finished cartridge. As well, once those cartridges are made, how to package them in an historical way. Mention has been made of X-Ring Services throughout the progress of the video. Its proprietor, Martin, offers all the supplies necessary to get your Snider up and running, brass and bullet.